And good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's public program with the Museum of Flight. My name is Cale Wilcox. I am the Public Engagement Manager down at the Museum of Flight in Seattle, Washington. Thank you all so much for joining us on this Memorial Day. We're so happy to have you here virtually for the time being still, as we hopefully see the light at the end of the tunnel of the current pandemic that's going on. But we certainly appreciate everybody being here with us tonight from the comfort of your own home. And welcome again to our program tonight. It is Memorial Day. In recognition of that, we are joined tonight by the President and CEO of the Museum of Flight, Matt Hayes, who would like to share a few thoughts about the day with our audience before we begin tonight. So please help me welcome to the stream tonight, President and CEO of the Museum of Flight, Matt Hayes. Hello, Matt.
Hello, Cale. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Cale mentioned the day that it is, and I know when I walked into the museum just this afternoon, and it's got the glorious sunshine and all the wonderful things we're thinking about, but most importantly, see just the row of flags at half mast, and it was just all the good and powerful things that we here at the museum, and I know all of you are remembering about today and why it is special to us and to our country. As always, I'm humbled and honored to be a part of the museum as we do this event, and so I'm very pleased also to share this evening with you. This is a day the museum is really proud to support. First set aside in 1868, it is for honoring and remembering those who give their lives in service of their country. I'd like to start by just thanking Cale, who we just heard from, and the rest of the incredible museum staff, not just for making all the technology work, but also because Cale, like the rest of us, didn't bother to waste one breath in asking if we should be doing our Memorial Day programs or our Veterans Day programs throughout this pandemic. Last year, it was a virtual event, if you were a part of that, and it was great to carry on that tradition. And still today, even though our doors are open to the museum, most of the in-person gatherings are still being canceled. But the conversation around Memorial Day and when we were getting ready for this focused on how to make it happen instead of if it should happen. We are excited to be open to the public again, and we're open 5 days a week, and in a few weeks we'll be open 7 days a week. And please remember, if you are local or if you're heading this way, that our Vietnam Veterans Memorial Park is open all the time, regardless of whether the museum is open. This park was veteran initiated, it was veteran-led effort, and was built for members of our military to honor those who came back and to honor those who did not. In fact, it was 2 years ago today that General Mattis and thousands of others helped open that park. Yet I think, at least for me, as moving as that day was, it's been the days that followed that mattered most, when thousands more, without the crowds or the fanfare, usually in the rain, the sun setting somewhere behind the clouds, but they came to remember the fallen, or perhaps quietly and proudly welcome home those who had not been welcomed in the past. And unlike those touching moments in that park, this evening's event is virtual, and sure, that's different. But I believe in the most fundamental way and the most important way, it's not really that different at all. Because for over 100 years, people in their homes and at cemeteries around VFWs have understood and recognized the sacrifice others have made for our country. They've shared words over lemonade, over coffee, maybe a beer, about what it means to lose someone close, or simply to thank the thousands that have voluntarily put themselves in harm's way for someone else. So whatever glass you have in front of you, whatever computer screens in front of you right now, I would argue that the ceremony today, this discussion today, is as poignant and as important and powerful as the one 2 years ago. We might not have fire trucks or fireworks or musicians on stage, but it's important because the people we are honoring are the same. The fanfare might be different, but that doesn't matter. The deeds and the sacrifice of the women and men we remember today are the same. And for them, and for that, I'm grateful. Okay, you're not here to listen to me. You are here to hear an incredible speaker that Cale is about to introduce. The story that Colonel Bjorkman is about to tell is the epitome of pretty much everything that I already mentioned. And the only thing better than a compelling and a moving story is a compelling and moving story that's well told. So I'm going to stop hogging the screen and move along. Thank you again for joining us this evening. Thank you, Colonel Bjorkman. And back to you, Cale.
Matt, thank you so much for those words. It is greatly appreciated, I am certain, by our audience here tonight. Okay, so like Matt said, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight's program. Our guest, Eileen Bjorkman, is the author of Unforgotten in the Gulf of Tonkin, a story of the U.S. military's commitment to leave no one behind. It is a book which presents a brief history of combat search and rescue from World War II through the Vietnam War, including the development of powerful capabilities that have saved hundreds of downed airmen, and in particular highlights the rescue of Navy pilot Willie Sharp, whose F-8 Crusader was downed by enemy fire on November 18th of 1965. Now, author Eileen Bjorkman is a retired United States Air Force colonel. She's a former military flight test engineer, as well as a civilian pilot and author. As a flight test engineer in the Air Force, she flew more than 700 hours in the rear seat of 25 different types of military aircraft, primarily the F-4, the F-16, the C-130, and the C-141. She has a BS degree in computer science from the University of Washington, MS and BS degrees in aeronautical engineering from the Air Force Institute of Technology, as well as a PhD in systems engineering from George Washington University. As I mentioned, she is a civilian pilot, and she has over 2,000 hours and owns an aerobatic airplane, a Super Decathlon, that she keeps up at Harvey Field in Snohomish. Her latest book, Unforgotten in the Gulf of Tonkin, was published in September of 2020 by Potomac Books, and her first book, titled The Propeller Under the Bed, A Personal History of Home-Built Aircraft, was released by the University of Washington Press in April of 2017. Now, before we welcome Colonel Bjorkman onto the screen here tonight, I wanted to share with you quickly this brief intro video that covers the book Forgotten in the Gulf of Tonkin. So we'll pull that up here. All right, please help me extend a warm virtual welcome to our speaker tonight, author Eileen Bjorkman. Eileen, welcome to our broadcast tonight from the Museum of Flight. How are you?
Good, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, and thank you for that introduction.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here with us today on this special day. Where are you joining us from?
I'm actually up in Everett, Washington.
Oh, fantastic. I hope you're enjoying this sunny holiday day that we're having. At this point, Eileen, I will turn it over to you. I'll get your presentation up here on the screen. And I will remind our audience that these virtual public programs, we do want to have them be interactive. If you have questions for our speaker tonight, You are watching from your home on YouTube, and you can enter your questions into the comment section there on the stream. After our speaker's presentation, we'll do audience Q&A, and we'll select some of those questions that our audience asks, and we'll pose them to our speaker. So without further ado, Eileen, I'll let you take over the talk here.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. So, can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I hope that video maybe whetted everybody's appetite a little bit for what you're going to see. What you saw was very much the Vietnam part of this presentation, which will just be at the very end here. But it was that rescue that got me interested in the history of combat search and rescue and the whole ethos of leaving no one behind in the first place. As I researched that rescue, I had originally planned to just write an article about it, but more and more, I started learning about the whole history of search and rescue and really everything that had led up to that moment where Willie Sharp was rescued. It was not necessarily a deliberate process that went on over time. It was sort of like a lot of things, it kind of started and stopped and started again. And I was just sort of fascinated by everything that happened over the years that led up to all of the forces being in place that day, just in time for for his rescue there. So I'll talk a little bit first about, like I said, that ethos of not leaving anybody behind, and then quickly go through this history here. Looks like a lot, but I'm just going to be hitting the wave top, so I can only do so much in about 45 minutes. So like I said, we'll just be hitting the wave tops, but hopefully I'll whet your appetite to learn more about this fascinating history of combat search and rescue. So the whole ethos of not leaving anyone behind. Well, first of all, it's embedded in our modern U.S. soldiers and airmen's creeds. The soldier's creed specifically says, "I will never leave a fallen comrade," and the airman's creed says, "I will never leave an airman behind." Though that wasn't always true. It wasn't always something that was very explicit. It was more something that evolved slowly over time. Although there has been, even in ancient times, there were many times where soldiers would, try to bring back their fallen airmen, whether they were injured or even killed. But it's something that really has kind of evolved, like I said, very slowly, and really became more prominent in the 20th century and on into the 21st century, especially within American culture. And it started with just finding people in the first place, searching for them and rescuing them after they got into trouble. And then that began to extend, especially in Vietnam, into recovering MIAs as well. MIAs for the most part, are people that have been killed and their remains weren't recovered. But there's a whole office now dedicated to recovering remains of people that died in overseas wars. And there's also this idea of making warriors whole again after they return. And I go into all of these topics in the book itself. I'm going to focus on search and rescue tonight, but the recovery of people, as you saw, there's still more than 80,000 people missing out there from wars since World War II, and then also making people whole again when they return. I think we do a pretty good job on the physical side of that. If somebody is badly injured, we do a pretty good job of rehabilitating them and helping them to re-enter the society and the workforce and everything. I'm not convinced we're really quite where we need to be, in terms of folks that have psychological issues, after they come back. So, PTS and some of those sorts of things. We still have a ways to go on that, but we do have a commitment to all of these, searching for people, rescuing them, recovering them if they don't make it back, and then making them whole again. And it's a sacred commitment. And it's not just because it's the right thing to do, because these are people. It also gives our warfighters an edge in battle, because if they have the confidence that if they get into trouble, that we're going to come get them, that we're going to do everything we can to bring them back and to make them whole again, that makes them better warriors. That makes them more confident to go into battle in the first place. So let's go all the way back to World War I. and look at what happened there. And much to my surprise, when I started doing this research, is there really wasn't any search and rescue during World War I. Most pilots didn't even wear parachutes, and it wasn't just pilots. There were observers and other kinds of aviators, but they didn't wear parachutes. Some of that was because people didn't really trust parachutes, and some of it was because commanders thought that the aviators might jump out of their airplanes too soon, and they didn't want them to lose the airplane. So a lot of aviators wound up crashing either on land behind enemy lines and then having to get themselves back. Some of them managed to land in the sea. If you see the area of operations, there was a lot of the battles were going on, relatively near to water, and so a lot of aviators were able to crash into the sea. And if they were lucky, a passing ship would pick them up and return them hopefully to the country that they had taken off from. But there were some rather dramatic rescues during World War I. This one in particular was actually an Australian pilot, Lieutenant Frank McNamara, and he was actually flying down in Gaza Strip here in the Mediterranean part of the war that was going on. And he was flying this aircraft called a Martinsyde. And he was actually injured while he was flying it. One of the shells that he released exploded, so he was kind of fratricide there. His shell injured his leg, and so anyway, so he's still flying around, trying to drop his bombs and help out. And another pilot, a British pilot, Captain Douglas Rutherford, he was flying this BE-2, and his engine got shot, and he wound up, the engine stopped, and he wound up landing. And so McNamara landed and tried to pick up Rutherford. Unfortunately, there's only one seat in this Martinsyde, and so Rutherford climbed onto the wing and grabbed onto one of the struts. But unfortunately, McNamara, because his leg was injured, couldn't control the aircraft on the ground, and the Martinsyde wound up flipping over. And so they weren't injured from that. They jumped back out and they ran back to the BE-2 and managed to get the engine started. Of course, it's a two-seat airplane, and so they managed to get the engine started and flew away again. So McNamara, because of his bravery, was awarded the Victoria Cross. So that happened in March of 1917. So, but those sorts of rescues were pretty far and few between. So, like I said, there were really no formal rescue, corps or anything like that, any tactics or anything. If somebody went down, they pretty much were on their own, and they had to rely on somebody like Frank McNamara to come pick them up. So, as I mentioned, there was a lot of controversy about using parachutes. That was another thing that surprised me. I would have thought that parachutes would have been very popular, but in fact, it turned out that there was a lot of resistance to them at first. Parachutes were quite common in those days. Actually, there were stunt jumpers that used them. And this woman, Tiny Broadwick, she did a lot of stunt jumping, and she was actually the first person to demonstrate the use of a ripcord in 1913 and to have a backpack. Early parachutes weren't in backpacks. They would just sling them over the side of the airplane or over a balloon or whatever. And then finally people got the idea to put them in backpacks so that you could actually fit them into an airplane. But then there was fears that a pilot wouldn't be able to pull the ripcord, that they would jump out of the airplane and they would black out before they could pull that ripcord. Well, Tiny Broadwick demonstrated that wasn't going to happen. But even after that, there was still, like I said, a lot of resistance to using the parachutes. In fact, Jimmy Doolittle himself thought that parachutes were for sissies. And when you've got somebody like Jimmy Doolittle saying, "I'm not going to wear a parachute," then of course everybody else is going to follow suit. But they did have parachutes there in Dayton, Ohio, where they were doing a lot of the early flight testing of different aircraft. And the pilots would occasionally take them along with them, even though they didn't really trust them and they didn't really plan to use them. But on October 20th, 1922, everything changed when this pilot, Lieutenant Harold Harris, he took an airplane up and was doing some dogfighting. He had just happened to put his parachute on that day. He almost didn't take it. He was wearing it. He was doing some dogfighting, and his plane disintegrated in midair. And he really didn't have any choice. He got kind of thrown out of the airplane. He pulled the ripcord, landed in a grape arbor, and then walked back to the base. And after that, everybody said, "Oh, I guess these things really do work." And so after that, people started wearing parachutes on a more regular basis. But going into World War II, so we had about 20-something years between the wars there. But the United States really didn't do anything to develop search and rescue capability between the wars. The Germans and the UK did do some work on developing search and rescue. They developed things like yellow dyes that you could put into the sea to attract attention. And they came up with having inflatable dinghies and life vests for aviators to wear, but it was still pretty rudimentary when the war got started. But the UK was really the first to note the benefits of having search and rescue, because they noted, hey, it costs a lot of money to train these aircrew members, pilots, whatever, and if we lose them, then they're sitting out the war and they cost a lot of money, and so we really should go try to get them back. And it also, they found, again, the pilots themselves said that they had more confidence going into battle, knowing that somebody would try to come get them, if they wound up landing in the sea, and that they weren't just on their own to try to rescue themselves. And the mission at that time did become known as air-sea rescue, because pretty much all the rescues were performed over water at that time. We didn't have any helicopters, so pretty much you had to go down in the water in order to be rescued, certainly in the early parts of the war. But again, the U.S. was rather unprepared, and when we first got over to the European theater, we relied very heavily on the UK to do the search and rescue mission. It wasn't until early 1943 that the United States started bringing in actual forces, search and rescue forces ourselves, that had been specifically trained to do that search and rescue mission. So some of the first aircraft that went over to do the search and rescue mission used this Catalina aircraft. So it's it's an amphibious aircraft, and it was a repurposed submarine patrol boat that the Navy was using, and the Air Force the Army Air Forces designated it the OA-10. And there's actually quite a few of these still flying today. They're beautiful aircraft. But this particular aircraft, when the Air Force started using it, they had some that were manufactured at a different location than the original ones were. And for some reason, the design, I don't know if it was just because of the manufacturing process that had to be used, but the design wound up being a little bit structurally weaker than the Navy aircraft. And so these Catalinas were prone to damage, when they landed on the water. So they were fine landing on land, but if they had to land in the water, they often got damaged. And so as a result, a lot of times they would not actually land. They would find a survivor, and then if there was a nearby boat, maybe try to get the boat to go pick up the survivors. If they landed and they had damage, though, in the European theater, things weren't that far apart, and so a lot of times they would just taxi to shore. That was a very common tactic to land. Okay, we're damaged. We got everybody on board. Okay, let's just start taxiing. And sometimes they would run into not run into literally, but encounter a ship, and the ship would take the survivors. In many cases, they would run out of gas before they actually got to shore, and a passing ship would then have to tow them back to shore. So it wasn't a great, it wasn't the greatest airplane to be using for search and rescue, but it got the job done. The biggest advantage it had was that it could stay airborne for many, many hours. And so, whether it was searching for somebody or just up there to support a mission in case somebody, wound up landing in the water, they could be there, right there in order to help them out. So some other aircraft that were involved in rescue. There were some L5 liaison aircraft, and then there were B-25 and B-17 aircraft, believe it or not. So the B-25s pretty much could drop maybe a little bit of equipment to folks, but the B-17s had these large life rafts that they could carry underneath, and they could drop, and these were very big life rafts, not the little things that you think about when you think of people in a life raft. I mean, these were actual real boats actually, and people could technically use them to, help themselves, rescue themselves. If they could figure out how to get to shore, they could use those themselves. Unfortunately, the European theater, they never actually got any of those lifeboats, but they did ship them to the Pacific theater, and they were used on several occasions in the Pacific theater. So. The other thing that happened was they did start to develop some tactics on how to actually do things more smartly. You don't just sit necessarily at the on shore waiting for somebody to call and say they need to be rescued. They figured out ways to go out, take off and be orbiting and waiting for something to happen. They also used aircraft like these P-47s. They were kind of older aircraft that they weren't using in the war anymore. And they repurposed these aircraft as so they couldn't actually rescue anybody, but they could find people better than the Catalinas in a lot of cases. They could get out there more quickly, and then when they would find people, they could drop a smoke bomb or something that would create enough smoke so that the Catalina was slower. It could then maybe come in and find the smoke and pick people up. And the other thing they figured out was to fly with one of these aircraft at a high altitude and one at a low altitude. The person at the low altitude would be looking for the survivor in the sea, because that was really hard just to even see people. And so they had a wide variety of things that they could use. Like I said, they had like dyes and flares, and they even had homing pigeons that some people carried, and there was all kinds of stuff. And then some people had radios too that they could use, but the radios were not that reliable, and there was a lot of false signals from those. So eyeballs on somebody was really the best way to find somebody. Anyway, once they would find somebody, the person down low, once they would find somebody, then they wouldn't be high enough to be able to radio back. So instead of waiting to climb back up, back up to a high enough altitude to radio back what they found, they would relay to the aircraft that was orbiting above them, and then that person would relay back to, because they were at a high enough altitude, they would relay back to actual rescue aircraft to come in and help out. So all of these tactics were being developed in Europe, and a lot of them were applied in the Pacific theater as well. But not everything worked as well in the Pacific theater. A lot of that was just because of the tyranny of distance. If you look at here in Belgium, there's I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but there's a blue arrow here, and that is 400 miles there. And then if you take that same blue arrow and you put it over here in the Pacific theater, and you see that that's also 400 miles over here. So the distances that they had to deal with, all of these little different different islands and everything, as they made their way up towards Japan, all of those distances were just horrendous to have to deal with in terms of search and rescue. So the OA-10 couldn't just land, be damaged, and taxi back to shore, so they were more reluctant to actually land and pick anybody up in the Pacific theater. Fortunately, there was a lot more submarines and ships in the Pacific theater, though. So in a lot of cases, the submarines and the ships that the Navy had could help out with rescues. The other thing was the Navy primarily just focused on rescuing their own pilots, and so they weren't really interested in rescuing the land-based pilots. So there was a little bit of a conflict there, because the Army Air Forces had kind of expected the Navy to help out a little bit more, and they didn't. And in a lot of cases, they actually had better equipment to help out. So I think there was a little bit of frustration there, a little bit of rivalry and animosity between the two services there. But there were some very good rescues that happened in the Pacific theater. This one in particular, I write about in my book. It's a rescue that happened on March 4th, 1945, and it was an attack of it was an attack on Zamboanga in the Philippines. It was a Japanese-held field, and they were going in there to attack this field, and there was a whole bunch of B-25s that participated in this raid. And the OA-10, the Catalina, it actually took off many hours before they took off from this Morotai in Indonesia. The OA-10 actually took off many hours before the B-25s did, because it was so slow, and it flew up and orbited up here waiting for the B-25s to come, and it was in place just in case somebody got shot down. Well, 3 B-25s got shot down during this raid. They all managed to ditch in the water, and everybody on board survived the ditching. Unfortunately, one man, the radio man from one of the B-25s, they still don't know what happened to him. He was alive when they started to evacuate the aircraft, and he just never surfaced. And so unfortunately, he wasn't able to be rescued. So, and I did just recently, first, I did not think to do this when I was researching my book, but I did just recently research to find out who that individual was. And his name is Corporal Joseph Schneiderhan. And he was from Pennsylvania. And so I thought it'd be very appropriate to remember him in particular on this Memorial Day, because he was the one that did not make it back from this particular mission. But there were 17 men that Roshkolb and his crew did rescue that day. The B-25s went down in very different places. They didn't all go down together, and they were doing this under fire. There were a lot of Japanese guns firing at them from the shore as they were trying to rescue everybody, and they were too heavy to keep taking off and landing, because every time they landed they risked being damaged again. And so they taxied from each to the different places. They picked up the first group, and then they taxied to the next place, and taxied to the third place. It took them about 2 hours to pick everybody up, and somewhere in there, one of the engines overheated and quit. And this flight engineer they had, this guy probably should have gotten a Medal of Honor. I think he wound up getting a Silver Star. But he got up on top of the OA-10 and managed to get the engine started again. And then when they finally got everybody on board, they were too heavy to take off. They couldn't take off. And Rauschkolb kept trying and trying and trying. He could not get airborne. And so they were throwing everything overboard they could. They were throwing over guns, everything they could think of. And so finally Rauschkolb just said, we got to get rid of fuel. Just let us, take as much fuel out as you dare, and let us still get back to the base. So the flight engineer did some quick calculations, and they dumped fuel in the ocean, and they finally managed to get airborne, and they flew 4 hours back to Indonesia there. And as they were taxiing in, the engines quit. So they just barely had enough fuel to get back. But they rescued the 17 people. And Rauschkolb wound up getting a Distinguished Service Cross, and the rest of the crew of the OA-10 all got Silver Stars. So pretty dramatic rescue, but kind of showed the ingenuity of the crews, and what they would do to try to get everybody back in one piece. The Navy, I mentioned, did have some of their own search and rescue aircraft. Like I said, some of their equipment was actually quite a bit better. A lot of their equipment was built originally for submarine patrol, and it was pretty sturdy. This was a Kingfisher. These aircraft would actually, bring these aircraft on board of different ships. So you see this crane here that's lifting this Kingfisher out of the water. So, and they also had they had some PBY-5 Catalinas that they used occasionally. And this individual, Lieutenant Nathan Gordon, he actually earned a Medal of Honor for a rescue that he did on the 15th of February in 1944. The Navy also, at the very end of the war, had several squadrons. They came up with 6 different squadrons that were specifically focused on search and rescue. And that was because as they pushed further north, they couldn't rely on the land-based aircraft anymore. So they could no longer rely on the services could no longer rely on the Army Air Force's land-based aircraft in order to be able to take care of search and rescue as they got closer and closer to Japan. So the Navy actually stood up 6 of these rescue squadrons and used those. And they used several different kinds of aircraft. I'm showing here the PBM-3 and the PBM-5. So in the meantime, we had the first helicopter rescue going on. I was quite surprised. I always assumed the first helicopter rescues took place in Korea, and turned out that no, actually there was quite a few towards the end of World War II. The very first one took place on the 21st of April in 1944 in Burma. The helicopters, the initial helicopters that were built were all sent to do special operations kinds of things, much like they do a lot of that today. and they went to Burma. And not long after arriving, there was a aircraft crashed. Air Commando L1 liaison aircraft crashed. There was the pilot and 3 British soldiers on board, and they crashed like several hundred miles away from where the helicopters were stationed. And this Second Lieutenant Carter Harmon, who had been a journalist before the war, and he had actually asked to fly helicopters because he thought he would get to stay stateside if he did that. He didn't realize they were sending them all to Burma, and so he wound up going over to Burma. Anyway, he gets the call to go rescue these folks, and it took him all day just to even get near the crash site because he had to stop like every 100 miles and refuel. So it was very, very slow progress, and he could only carry one person at a time in the helicopter. Just him and one other person was all that could fit. So, and anyway, another one of these big, long, dramatic rescues. I'm not going to go into all the gory details, but they were making their way to a sandbar for him to be able to pick everybody up on this sandbar and take them back and rescue them. And they eventually were able to get everybody out. So again, I thought it was very interesting that this happened much sooner than I thought it did originally. And they actually made 43 overland rescues with this particular unit. Before they left at the end of the war. So you'd think with all this that everybody would go, hey, this search and rescue stuff is pretty good. We saved a lot of people, and let's keep doing this. But unfortunately, it's like most wars. The war's over. Okay, let's start shutting everything down. We don't need all this stuff. Budget cuts, and so they shut down the search and rescue school, which they had just stood up like about a year earlier. They had finally gotten it really going. They shut that down, and then there was a lot of wrangling over who should have the mission. Some people thought the Coast Guard should have it, but they're not worldwide. The Army kind of maybe sort of wanted it, but not really. The Navy didn't want it at all. So anyway, they finally gave it to the Army, which then, of course, it became the Air Force a couple years later. But fortunately, this gentleman, Richard Kite, he was actually a lieutenant colonel at the time. He retired as a brigadier general. He took over the Air Rescue Service in 1946, and he was the one that really made search and rescue a thing. So he was the one that said, hey, this needs to be a worldwide thing, and air rescue needs to have its own mission and motto and be recognized as everybody as a real mission. And he was the one that penned what's called the Code of an Air Rescue Man. And he talks in there, he's the one that came up with the phrase, these things I do that others may live. So that you've probably seen the search and rescue units that use this slogan, and he was the one that came up with that particular phrase. He also was very interested in getting actual equipment to the search and rescue forces that was built for search and rescue. If you remember when I was talking about the Catalinas that were used initially, they were not built for search and rescue, and it showed. Obviously something that gets damaged mostly when you land it on the water is probably not a good rescue aircraft. So he oversaw the development of this SA-16 Albatross, which was the first purpose-built search and rescue aircraft that we had in the United States. The S stood for search and rescue, and the A stood for amphibian. You can see that this is an amphibious aircraft, and it was ready in time to be used during the Korean War. So another thing that happened in the same time frame, and it had started actually during World War II, but they started training pararescue jumpers. So the PJs, you may have heard people talk about PJs. A lot of them are special ops folks, but some of them are just regular search and rescue folks, and they're the ones that jump out of the aircraft and help a downed person, because sometimes a downed person can't get themselves into an aircraft or into a hoist or something, and so you have people who are specially trained, medics and so forth, in order to be able to help with those folks. So moving on into Korea, again, we didn't, like I said, we didn't really learn our lessons very well. The initial SAR forces that we had capable of going into Korea, they were fairly small, but eventually, we're able to get in the equipment that we needed. So I think we had the SA-16, we had the H-5 helicopter by then, and then several other kinds of helicopters as well. And we still had the B-17s and actually B-29s available from World War II that could drop the lifeboat. So it was actually quite a bit of equipment available. It was just a matter of, getting it into place and kind of figuring out how to use it again. In just a few years, people had kind of forgotten how to do all of this stuff. But the thing that Korea really showed was the utility of the helicopter to be able to rescue somebody from behind enemy lines. And the first time that happened was on the 4th of September in 1950, so not too far into the war. So there was Captain Robert Wayne. He bailed out of a fighter over North Korea. And the helo pilots, they hadn't actually been trained in combat search and rescue. And so the squadron commander said, hey, I'm not going to tell you to go get that guy, because you've got to go behind enemy lines. You haven't trained for that. But Captain Paul Van Boven said, no, we'll go. We'll go in there. And Wayne's wingman had stayed with them. He was flying over him. And so he was able to direct the helicopter in. And he also, had some ammunition still on board. And so he was able to, help ward off some enemy soldiers. As they approached, as they approached the down pilot, for Van Boven and his crew to be able to get in there and pull the pilot out. And that, that was a very useful technique that they continued to use. Was having somebody that could shoot back. Somebody that could provide armed cover while the helicopter was able to go in and make the pickup. Very common tactic that they used throughout Korea and into Vietnam as well, and still use today. So these are just a couple of the other kinds of aircraft that you had. I mentioned or just some pictures. I mentioned the H-5 and the SA-16, and then also the SB-29, which is the search and rescue version, which you can see the big lifeboat that's down here that they could drop. Now, one of the things that the SA-16, even though it had been specifically designed for search and rescue, it still had some issues in Korea. It didn't really do well in high seas. And it also didn't do well in icing conditions. So it didn't always do that well in Korea, but overall it was a very good search and rescue aircraft. And some of those shortcomings actually weren't a big factor in Vietnam. There's not a lot of icing in Vietnam, obviously, and so some of the issues that it had didn't detract from its performance during Vietnam. So after Korea, once again, we kind of forgot about search and rescue. Despite the fact that they had rescued more than 1,000 downed airmen, both from the United States and our allies, they decided after Korea that we didn't really need to do search and rescue anymore. And a lot of that was because of the nuclear doctrine. There was this thinking that if you're going to have a nuclear war, there's not really going to be anybody left to rescue. And so they started to draw down the search and rescue forces. Once again, they no longer trained for combat, and they really focused on picking up pilots who had ejected, like say during training missions, stateside or at one of our overseas bases. They developed this HH-43 firefighting helicopter. And they would pretty much sit around at a base, when there were missions going on. And then if a pilot, crashed on the runway or near the runway, the helicopter would take off. And they had, you don't see it in this picture, but there was this giant fire extinguisher, a big sphere, that they would lift up, and they would fly it over to the aircraft, that was burning, and then they had firefighters on board that would get out and use the fire extinguisher to put out the fire and rescue the crew. So that was pretty much the main mission that they had for several years there. And then we started going into Vietnam, in the early 60s. And initially, once again, we didn't really have any dedicated search and rescue forces. We had search and rescue forces, scattered around, like these HH-43 units, and we had some HE-16s, still in service and everything, but they initially were not in Vietnam. And some of that was just because, initially we weren't supposed to be doing combat in Vietnam. And if we had search and rescue forces in Vietnam, that would imply that we were doing combat. So there was a little bit of reluctance to actually bring those actual forces in. And so they relied heavily on Army helicopters and Air America, contractor pilots. And, again, these, they're good folks, but they're not trained in the search and rescue mission itself. And so they had a lot of problems. They would just try to find somebody and say, hey, could you go look for this person? And so they wound up not really being very effective in their search and rescue. But a gentleman named Alan Saunders arrived in Vietnam in June of 1943. And he immediately said, we got to do better. He had actually been in Burma during World War II, and he knew what they were dealing with in the jungle, how much harder it was with the jungle they had and the mountainous terrain and everything. Excuse me. And so he started actually bringing in some forces into Vietnam, and those forces started arriving in June of 1964. So just a couple months before the Gulf of Tonkin incident that was in August of 1964 that really kicked off the Vietnam War, Saunders had managed to bring some equipment in. So he had gotten some albatrosses, which were by now called HU-16s instead of SA-16s. And they were, some of those were stationed at Da Nang, which is fairly close to the DMZ you see here. So, and they could obviously rescue people who, went down into the Gulf of Tonkin over here on the east. You also had HU-16s that were at Karat Royal Thai Air Base, and then some HH-43s at NKP, also there in Thailand. So he had managed to get a few forces in, but nothing significant. Everything was still kind of a bit of a pickup game. But just a couple months later, the Gulf of Tonkin incident happened, and then then lots of aircraft started pouring into Vietnam. And the need for combat search and rescue really started to escalate, and so they quickly started to figure out better ways to do the search and rescue. And so within a couple months after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, they started having better coordination, where they would have the HU-16s take off from Vietnam and say orbit, waiting, for people who, for pilots who are say striking North Vietnam, just in case they got shot down. The HU-16s would already be orbiting in place in order to go be able to pick them up. And then you also had Sky Raiders, A1s that were stationed with that were Navy aircraft. The Air Force had some of these as well, but the ones that they were using for search and rescue primarily came from aircraft carriers, and they would come and provide armed cover for the HU-16s. So they would all kind of form up together and fly around together whenever a mission was going on in case something went wrong. And so then if something went wrong, they would already be in place to be able to go and look for the downed pilot or downed crew and be able to pick them up. So they did start, like I said, kind of bringing all of these pieces together. And these are some of the aircraft that they had at Da Nang. So here's your HU-16. This is a crew, Captain Dave Westenbarger. He's the one pointing here on the aircraft in his HU-16 crew. And they actually he earned a Distinguished Service Cross for a mission that he flew, a rescue mission. We've also got the HH-43s, and here's a couple of HH-43 pilots, Captains John Christensen and Jim Sobel, and they were in the first wave of folks that went over to Da Nang after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So before the HH-43s were not at Da Nang, it was just the HU-16s. But after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, he was stationed at Minot. They were in Minot, North Dakota, and his squadron got tapped to these two guys. Their squadron got tapped to go over to Da Nang, and so they were in that first wave of folks that went over there as well. So very early in the war still. So you saw in that previous piece, you had all these folks kind of loitering out over the water there, and remember I talked about the Albatross being a pretty good search and rescue vehicle, but it too was a little bit prone to be damaged if it landed in the water. So it wasn't as bad as the Catalina, but they were not risk-free, and so they would try not to land in the water unless they absolutely had to. So obviously they would if somebody was in immediate danger. They weren't worried about damage, and they rarely were damaged to the point where they couldn't take off. So that was the thing with Catalina. A lot of times it was damaged to the point that it actually couldn't take off, whereas the Albatross could still take off, but they'd have to fix it when they got it back home. The other thing was the Albatross was used as kind of a command and control aircraft, and so if it had to land and pick somebody up and take them back, then they no longer had a command and control aircraft, and they would have to launch another aircraft to come. So they really would prefer to have a helicopter come pick somebody up if they could. The problem is the helicopters were all on the aircraft carriers, and the aircraft carriers were a long ways away. They stayed far away from the shore. They just couldn't get in that close, you know, and so somebody had the idea that, well, we have a lot of these smaller ships, you know, these destroyers and cruisers, and you know, they would carry anti-aircraft missiles and act as kind of air traffic controllers and that sort of thing. And they operated a lot closer to shore. And somebody got the idea, hey, could we land a helicopter on a cruiser? You know, would it fit? And it turns out they do. And they actually had done this even before. Before they actually used it during the war in Vietnam. They had actually demonstrated that they could do this, and they demonstrated on a cruiser called USS Gridley. And the original thinking was they were going to use this like to fly around spare parts and mail and that sort of thing. And for some reason they didn't do that. And because it was right before the Gulf of Tonkin incident that they did this demonstration. And so I kind of think maybe they kind of forgot about it. But then somebody maybe remembered it. The whole history of how this came about is a little bit lost, if you will. So I'm just speculating, like I said, that they kind of forgot about it. But then in November of 1965, they got the idea to let's try this again. And so they actually sent, initially on November 8th, they sent a Sea Sprite, a UH-2, that's this helicopter here, to USS Turner. It was just kind of a last-ditch exercise, you know, just say, hey, you know, we've got this massive rescue going on, and we're getting into a lot of trouble. Let's just send the Sea Sprite just in case. It turned out they wound up having to use it, and so then, like the very next day, they sent another UH-2, a Sea Sprite, to land on Gridley, the one that they had landed on originally a little over a year earlier, and that crew was going to stay on Gridley for like 10 days just to see if this was going to work. The very first day they were on the Gridley, that very first night, they had a rescue. There was a Marine Corps pilot who was flying an A-1. It was at night, and he wound up landing in the water, and they launched and picked him up and brought him back. And so they showed that this could actually work. So a week later, on the 18th of November, 1965, which if you remember from the video, was the day that Willie Sharp got rescued, all of these forces were in place, just waiting there. So again, it wasn't perfect. You know, it was still a little bit of a pickup game at that time. You know, I think the Sea Sprite there on the Gridley was still considered to be experimental at that point, and they weren't sure that this was really going to work. But all of the pieces that he needed to help get through his rescue were there. And it was only because, like I said, of all this, several years of people kind of putting this together and figuring it out. It's not like, somebody sat down right when the war started and said, this is all the stuff we need to do. This was literally people like Major Saunders and people on board carriers going, well, what if we do this and what if we do that? And just, figuring this out and putting it all together so that it all came together for Willie on that fateful day, so that he could be rescued. So, and I did want to just mention one other person, this Memorial Day, one of Willie's rescuers, Lieutenant J.G. Jim Welsh, was one of the pilots that picked him up out of the waters there that day. And he unfortunately died in a fire on the Oriskany. He was an Oriskany pilot. He died on a fire in the Oriskany that took place on October 26, 1966, and 43 other people died in that in that fire with him. So, and they were in the Gulf of Tonkin at the time. So I did want to just mention one more thing in my talk, that Willie's inspiration to become an F-8 pilot in the first place was inspired by the F-8 that's in the Museum of Flight. So Willie grew up in Dinuba, California, and he would read the Fresno Bee every day. And on May 31st, 1956, the Fresno Bee had a picture of that aircraft, the XF-8U, it was called at the time. It's kind of hard to see on my screen here. This is a copy that I got from the Fresno Library, and so it's pretty grainy there. So, but you can see that picture. And so he was 15 years old. He opens up this paper and he sees this F-8 and he just goes, wow, that has just got to be the coolest airplane in the world to fly. I would love to do that. But he didn't know how to do that. I mean, he was just a kid in a farm town, and he didn't really think he had any opportunity to do that. But then after college, he started talking to the Navy about possibly joining up, and then they said, hey, you could be a pilot. You're qualified to be a pilot. And he was like, really? I could fly an F-8? And it turned out that yes, in fact, he could. And he made it all the way through, aviation cadets and his pilot training and everything. And he got to fly that dream aircraft. Not this one, obviously, but this is the one that inspired him to begin that journey in the first place. So, and I finally got to see it on display in the museum today. I went down and actually took this picture late this morning. I did see the aircraft before. I saw it when it was being worked on in the Restoration Center up here in Everett. I was working on an article about the F-8 for Air and Space Magazine at the time, and went over and got to take a look at it. It's a beautiful aircraft, and I'm really glad that you've got it there in the Museum of Flight. So that's all I've got. I'm open to your questions. The book is available at the Museum of Flight store. It's available online, and I was actually just there today and saw it in the bookstore there. So, and if you want to look at the book trailer yourself, it is there on YouTube. You can go there, and that's all I've got. So, pending your questions.
Eileen, excellent presentation, and thank you so much for that. That was fantastic. I will remind our audience here, if you have any questions for our presenter tonight, go ahead and enter them in the chat section there on YouTube. I like to kick off the Q&A just to kind of get the ball rolling. Eileen, one of the things that stood out to me in that book that you touched on a little bit in your presentation was just the sheer number of bureaucratic hurdles that had to be overcome in the planning and the training and the learning from past experiences with the search and rescue. That it's interesting how easy it is to take for granted these systems that exist that seem obvious now, right? That parachute story you told is a perfect example. Seems like something that would be an obvious bit of technology that would come in very handy, but the amount of convincing it took of people was that was a fascinating part of the story. So not really a question, sorry, on my part, but I really appreciated that part of the book. One of the things that I do like to ask our authors, what is the experience like writing a book, and what kind of resources did you have access to for the research for this?
So the best resource I had was Willie himself. So I started with him, and then he knew a lot of the names of the people who had been involved in the rescue, and I was able to start tracking some of them down. And then as far as the actual combat search and rescue, as I got interested in how these different forces got in place, the Air Force Historical Research Agency, they actually had an oral history from Major Saunders. I used that. There was a thing called Project Chico, CHECO, and I can't remember what that stands for, but it was a series of reports that they published that the Air Force published, or I guess it was all of DoD published about Southeast Asia and what was going on there. I used some of those reports. I found Texas Tech University has a wonderful Vietnam archive, and I was able to just mine that for all kinds of Navy reports. And then also I was living in the DC area when I was doing a lot of the research, and I was able to go to the Navy Yard, the Naval History and Heritage Command there. And I was able to actually look at all of the, I was actually able to read the rescue report from Willie's mission and the combat loss report, along with a lot of other information. That's where I discovered that the Gridley, that they had landed that helicopter on the Gridley in 1964. There was just this picture sitting in in one of the files there, and nobody had probably looked at it in 60 years, and I pulled this thing out, and I'm like, what is this, and when I first mentioned it to some people, they're like, no, that didn't happen. And I sent them all the stuff. They're like, oh, I guess it did happen. So.
That's fantastic. Another thing that struck me going through the timeline, especially of the Vietnam portion, was that parallel to what was happening in the early 60s in Vietnam with search and rescue was the American space program and helicopters being used to recover astronauts at sea. Was there any cross-pollination between those two operations, or were they both kind of developed in their own areas?
They pretty much were developed alone. In fact, that was one I didn't bring that up in the book, but in the oral history that Saunders had, he did complain a little bit about that hey, we're devoting all these resources to going and pulling astronauts out of the ocean, and we've got people dying in Vietnam. There's something wrong here. And that was kind of his take on it. But I really don't think there was a whole lot that was there maybe were some lessons learned and things like that, but there wasn't really a lot of cross-pollination going on that I could tell.
That's interesting. We have a question from an audience member. This one referring to the Battle of Midway. He says there were a number of naval aviators shot down during the Battle of Midway that were eventually rescued after the battle, the most famous probably being Lieutenant George Gay. Do you know what the rescue techniques were that would have been used specifically at that time in the Battle of Midway?
I'm guessing it. Yeah, I really don't know. I'm based on, let's see. So Battle of Midway was 40.
Yeah, early 43, I believe.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that they probably, if they had like some PBYs that were available, they may have used those, but more likely they were probably rescued by, passing ships, ships that happened to be near. So.
Excellent. Another question from our audience here. Can you reflect on what the current state of search and rescue is for our armed forces? Do all the U.S. services have their own independent search and rescue units, or is there any joint operation in that regard?
So it really is. It's considered a joint mission, but really the Air Force is the one that has the mission today. There are folks in the other services that do help out with with search and rescue. But the Air Force is really the one that has the lead for the combat search and rescue part of that. So that doesn't mean the other services don't participate in combat search and rescue, but the Air Force is really the lead service on all of those, on all of that.
Excellent. Yeah, if you do read the book, there's a long history of that question of who is going to be in charge of the search and rescue operations. Warren Peterson, another one of our audience members, says he watched the interview with Willie, but it ended before he could tell the story of his rescue. I would say it's recounted very well in the book. It's a great opportunity to hear what happened to Willie. Looking for other questions to come in here. How was your time at the museum today, Eileen? It's very nice to see that you had a very fresh picture of that F-8 there in the Great Gallery.
It was great. I hadn't been there since, it's been probably 3 or 4 years since I've been to the museum, and I hadn't seen the Vietnam display at all. So, and I've seen some of those aircraft, because not all of those aircraft just got in there now, but to see them all there together and I loved all the maps and everything. I just loved, there's like a 3D map there, terrain map of Vietnam and Laos, and it just, that was the first time I'd ever seen a 3D map like that, and it just really brought out it just seemed the 3D versus just looking at a 2D map. It just made the terrain and everything and the location of all the different places in Vietnam. It just made it more alive to me than I've ever seen before.
Yeah, that is a fantastic addition to that exhibit down there. It's a very popular part of it. We have another question here from the audience. Is there a crossover between the pararescue service and other special forces, i.e. the Navy SEALs?
I don't know. Yeah, I would assume that they train together. I would assume that they have separate training, in terms of their initial training. But I know that all of the different, special forces, they occasionally train together, and I'm sure that they probably borrow, equipment and ideas and everything from each other. I know the special operations folks are they're very innovative, and they're always, I think, they're not afraid to use what somebody else has come up with. So I would imagine that there's a fair amount of crosstalk among them.
Yeah, it seems like a very intentional program these days compared to how it was in the past there. There's another question from the audience here. Do you have any stories about the Fulton surface-to-air recovery system? Is that anything that's come up in your research?
No, that was one of the things that I was actually originally planning to write about in the book, but the book kind of started going a different direction. When I was originally going to write about that and some of the other kind of crazy things that people have come up with, but I know it has actually been used. I was surprised because that was when I was doing a little bit of research when I was thinking I was going to write about it. I was going to write about it as this kind of wacky idea, but it turns out it's actually been used for a few actual recoveries. So there's actually, if you Google it, you can find quite a bit of information online about the development and when it's actually been used. So yeah.
Just in a nutshell, how does that system work?
So it's it's basically it's like think of it as kind of like a needle on the front of a C-130, and it's like a big it's kind of like a big sword, if you will. So I'm not sure exactly how to describe it. So and the person that's going to be recovered, they put on a vest, and my understanding, the way it works, I've seen a couple of videos, is they put on this vest, and there's like a balloon that goes up, and then they fly by with this this big like kind of spike thing, like I said, and the balloon it's attached basically to it's like a rope kind of thing, a chain. I don't know exactly what it is. So anyway, it snags the person, with this rope as it goes by, and pulls them off the ground. And then, wow. Yeah, I know it sounds crazy. But apparently they really used it a couple times. So yeah, like I said, I'm not sure of all the mechanics of how it works, but it is one of those things that you go, what? Somebody would actually do, it sounds like it would kill somebody to do that, but in fact they are able to use it. So yeah.
Well, at least we know that there's people out there using their ingenuity to try everything when it comes to recovering people. Yeah. I know in your book there's a few stories of some one-off rescue devices that are creative and entertaining all at the same time. I'd highly recommend to our audience to pick up a copy of Eileen's book. It's a fantastic read. I'm not seeing any other questions come in here, Eileen. Before we terminate the program tonight, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with on this Memorial Day?
I think just to, we talked a lot here today about, not leaving anybody behind in terms of the search and rescue part of it, but those other two aspects are still very important, especially on Memorial Day. I think the aspect of the continued search for the MIAs and not forgetting about those folks. A lot of them are not recoverable, because they are lost at sea or something. But there are a fair amount that could possibly be recovered, and I think it's a mission that is well worthwhile, and it's one of those missions that's easy to forget about, but I think it's very important, and to continue that search, to continue the funding for that search, and not to forget about those folks.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic thought. Thank you so much, Eileen, for being with us here tonight and sharing some information about your book. Big thank you to our audience for joining us on this Memorial Day. Thank you to Matt Hayes, our president and CEO, for his words at the beginning of the program this evening. Folks, all of you out there watching, thank you so much for your continued support of the Museum of Flight. If you enjoyed tonight's program, there is a donation link in the description of the video. If you're interested in financially contributing to the museum, we certainly always appreciate that. We also hope to see you all back down at the museum sooner rather than later. Information about visiting the museum is available on our website. Highly encourage you to check that out before planning a trip down there. But as Matt did mention, our doors are open. We are able to allow members of the public in, and we look forward to seeing you all as the weather improves and we move into the summer. Eileen, once again, thank you so much. It was so great having you here tonight. And with that, folks, we'll go ahead and terminate tonight's program. Thank you very much. Have a pleasant rest of your Memorial Day weekend.